I'm not a great fan of the Treasury. Never have been, never will be. Um, they are an overtly political bureaucracy, and they have been for a very, very long time. In fact, as long as I've been in public life. They offer advice that comes as much from an ideological perspective, I think, as anything else, and they're often wrong. In fact, it's been my experience in public life that their predictions contained usually in their fiscal statements or in their budgets that are released are often wrong, and it's seriously wrong. So the idea that an accurate Treasury prediction is basically an oxymoron. And that's been my experience of the last, ever since I've been in politics. So it goes back to the mid 1980s. I think Rob Muldoon, former late National Party Prime Minister, had similar criticism of them in the 10 years preceding that. But anyhow, Treasury have a particularly ideological view, and they are what would normally considered austere. Although sometimes there's heads in the toilet, a la Grant Robertson and the reaction to COVID, for example, and they get wise after the event. And it's a fair criticism that Grant Robertson makes of them. Yeah, you gave me this advice after it had gone. Anyhow, this week they released, it has to be said, something that caused a bit of a shudder through the government. And this relates to the Treasury long-term fiscal statement, where every 4 years, and this is a relatively new innovation, I think, Treasury reports on the country's finances for the next 40 years. Now, to be honest with you, it's almost absurd that they do that, and what a waste of bureaucracy trying to do so. But what they try to do is extrapolate what's going on now and then project it 40 years into the future. And essentially, that's what they did in this particular case as well. They have warned basically that the New Zealand economy is going to fall off a cliff sometime in the next 40 years. The question is, when is that? And then they've projected net core crown debt, but essentially what they've essentially argued, if I can just sum it up for you, is that if the government policy settings are covered into the future, with our ageing and, it has to be said, declining health population as well, we won't be making enough money to pay the bills. We'll be seriously in debt, and essentially, you'd almost say we're on a one-way path to bankruptcy. So those are pretty much the headlines that came out of the Treasury projection this week. Now, somebody who has taken them very seriously indeed is the Taxpayers Union. And so when they sent me the email, they highlighted the fact that Treasury Secretary Ian Rennie had said that none of the choices for incoming governments or this one are easy, but if we do not close the structural deficit in the shorter term, it will tighten policy constraints over time, and that will lead to even more drastic policy adjustments in the future. So basically, Ian Rennie's argument was, you've got to get your act together now. As I said, the Taxpayers Union, this is, well, I won't say it's music to their ears, because they have been saying this now for some months, if not some years, and they have been very critical of the policies of Finance Minister Nicola Willis. Join us to talk about that, reaction to Treasury, and what the policy prescription would be if we're not going to go on the current path. James Ross, the Head of Policy and Legislative Affairs at the Taxpayer Union, joins us now. James, thank you so much for joining us. You went to the Treasury briefing, I see, with you and a couple of other tax union officials. Did it surprise you, or is that pretty much in line with what you've been saying for the last year or so?
Yeah, I mean, we've, as you as you say, we've not been quiet about this. We've been drawing attention to the fact that we're on a deeply unsustainable path for a fair while now. But it is always scarier when you hear it coming from these sort of very buttoned up Treasury officials. The mood in that room was pretty dour, and rightly so. I think what they were saying and what they were drawing attention to is the fact that we have one of the worst structural deficits in the developed world, that path isn't sustainable. If we carry on down that path, we are going to hit a debt crisis within a couple of decades. Now, it's easy to say 2065 is a long time away, and it is. And it's easy to
Sorry,
pretend that
a couple of
we're,
decades is a long time away. I'll talk about that in just a second. But can I ask you though, what is a structural deficit, please, for our listeners?
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the sort of long and short of it is, if you're in an economic downturn, you'd expect some deficit spending, tax revenue would fall, um, expenditure would go up. You expect that a structural deficit is outside of that. So even if the economy was at full pelt and it was booming, we would still be in deficit, which shows essentially that the government is spending well beyond its means. Now that structural deficit is sitting at about 5.5 billion, 6 billion this year, which is about half of the total deficit. So that's the absolutely critical part that we really need to be tackling, because it's not going to go away on its own.
So a structural deficit means that I'm spending $5 to $6 billion more than I'm gaining in revenue. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the structural deficit is, even if imagine everything was going right in New Zealand and the economy was firing on all cylinders, we're at full capacity, we would still be in that structural deficit. So we'd still be in a deficit of about 5 or 6 billion. As it
What causes that? So why if everything's going okay and presumably we've got lesser welfare numbers and we're getting record money from revenue, from taxation because the economy's going so well and GDP growth's up, why would we still be in a structural deficit?
because we'd still be spending more than we would be raising in tax revenue.
And where is that expenditure going? What are the primary sources or primary end game for the money to create most of that deficit?
Yeah, well, I think the core takeaway is that essentially everything is costing that little bit more, in no small part because sort of core government bureaucracy is still it's still larger than it was at the time of the election. There's been some cuts and some increases between then and now, but there's still about 120 more bureaucrats now than there were at the time of the election, and that's about 18,000 more than there were in 2017. I think the last time we were in a surplus was about 2018, 2019. So I mean, that's really where we're sort of aiming for. The fact is, we're just spending too much, and the point is, we're not making as much in tax revenue as we need to cover the spending. We're also seeing the economy declining. Growth isn't just insufficient; it's going backwards. If we raise those tax revenues by increasing tax rates, we're going to get less growth. That's going to exacerbate these problems that we're seeing down the line. The simple prescription is that we have to be spending less.
Okay. Now, the question is where. So what you're saying, and forget about 40 years' time, because that's never stuff for me. I'm more interested in the points that you're making now, that we're increasing debt and that we're funding essentially our current spending by not just taxation but also by borrowing, and that makes our deficit worse. Gotcha. But I'm interested in the areas that you would slash and burn first. So the first thing you've talked about is, and you're right, why are these 18,000 people that we've employed in the public sector over the last 6 years, who obviously haven't added to productivity of the economy, why are they still there, given that they were identified as a problem prior to the last election by many people, including Nicola Willis? What's the answer to that question? Have you got one, James?
Why they're still there?
Mm.
I mean, we've been banging our head at the wall asking the same question. There's I mean, the government are almost doing themselves a disservice where they're pushing this austerity narrative that they're cutting without making any of the cuts. The simple answer is that we have to right size. We've got into a position where you've now got, maybe 1.5 or 2 people doing the job that one person used to do back in the day. You've just got to get that culture back of public servants delivering at full pelt. And I think that's the fundamental issue, is that we've seen a culture shift across government, and we just need to wind that back. Easier said
Is
than
the
done, of
government
course.
being captured by the bureaucracy? I mean, it's the great danger, but within the last 2 years, the narrative that's running now is pretty much that, well, we're doing what we can. Um, don't worry, things will turn out okay when the economy starts growing again and everybody catches up. Is there a view amongst the government or ministers, do you think, that the bureaucracy are right, that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them, we just need to steer the course?